Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we have the most fascinating panel talking about Iran and the current revolution going on in the country. We've got three very astute observers and participants in that revolution. We have Mahnaz Asghari, who is our executive assistant at the podcast at Chapman University. Welcome, Mahnaz.
Thank you.
We have Nazanin Nour, who may be a very familiar face to you. She's a well-known actress and writer and host, and we're delighted to have her here. We're going to talk a little bit about one of her most recent projects, which was Persia's Got Talent. And it's going to be very interesting to hear her experiences with that. Welcome, Nazanin.
Thank you for having me.
And we have Dr. Montreh Tavakkoli. Dr. Tavakkoli is a hematology oncologist based in Philadelphia, and her work in protesting the current situation in Iran is nothing less than heroic and very well documented. Dr. Tavakkoli, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think what we want to start with is just so that listeners have an idea of what it is actually like. You know, it's one thing for us to talk about abstract principles, but actually how these policies and the repression of women takes place, I think is something people are not that familiar with. So one of the things that started our wanting to do this is being told by Mahnaz, who we work with all the time, her experiences in Iran, not too way back. And so Mahnaz, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened to you and why it happened?
Sure. I will talk about my experience, but let me tell you that every woman in Iran has some kind of experience with the morality police. So the morality police arrested me because we were assumed to be wearing improper hijab. I remember I was 22 years old. I was hanging out with my friend at a movie theater, and after we left, I saw the morality police van, the Gasht Sarallah was parked there, and one of them came to us and said, get into the van. And I said, why? We're just wearing we're fully covered, and my car is right there, and we want to go home. And he said, no, just you're going to get into the van. And we had to. They forced us to go to the van, and we did. And they arrested us, and we were held overnight in jail. At the time when cell phone didn't exist, without any communication with my parents, I remember at least it took 8 to 10 hours to let us to contact with our parents. It was a horrible experience, not knowing what is going to happen next. And I remember the next day, we went in front of Mullah/judge, and he ordered 30 lashes. They treated us like a criminal. It was awful. So I believe what happened to Mahsa Amini is not a novel experience for women in Iran. And back then we wanted to fight back. We wanted to do something, but we forced to come from out of fear. There wasn't any social media. Nobody could hear our voice. So what we could do. So I remember the first thing that my dad said at that time said, this country is not a safe place for you or any of us, and we need to leave.
I see Montreh and Nazanin both nodding their heads, going, been there, done that. I'd love to hear from you, Montreh, what your experience is in it. And obviously this is a horrible thing to have happened to anyone, but how common is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I haven't personally experienced it just because I haven't spent much time in Iran. I was born in the States, born and raised in the States. But every Iranian knows someone who's been affected by this regime, irrespective of gender. I know one too many people, for example, who've received lashes for going to gatherings or for doing literally nothing just because the Basij had gotten bored and wanted to pick on someone. A gay friend of mine was gang raped by the besieged for being queer. The list goes on. But in preparation for this question, I actually conducted a poll on social media. And I have some truly wonderful followers, and I wanted to represent them and to tell the stories, or their stories on this podcast today. So I asked the women who had actually lived in Iran at any point of their lives whether they had ever been harassed by the morality police. And among those who answered yes, I asked whether they were taken into captivity or had received lashes, what kind of harassment they had endured, and what the regime had claimed they had done wrong. And so the results are as follows. 85% said that they experienced harassment at the hands of the morality police. 20% had said that they'd been taken into captivity and or received lashes. And in terms of the types of harassment they had endured, here are a few of their stories. One woman said, when I was 11, I was on a trip to Mashhad. They followed me and tried to take me away. I ran for my life as they chased me, yelling, "Tora bayad bebarim dorostet bokonim," in reference to the hijab, which translates to, "We have to take you and fix you." Another woman explained, "I got lucky. I was held outside the morality police van until my mom came and gave them money. I was ticketed for wearing makeup and nail polish. I could hear people crying and screaming inside the van. I was barely wearing anything, mascara, concealer, lip gloss, and I had short red nails." Another explained, "My sister was 14 and her and her friends were harassed for not wearing the hijab properly, or just to screw with them, like just walking home from school, not doing anything. When we left Iran, my sister couldn't take her hijab off at the airport. The trauma is like no other." Another said, "They arrested me and two of my friends because we had nail polish on. We were 16. They took us in, forced us to remove our nail polish, and forced us to remove cotton balls from a sack that had roaches in it while they yelled profanities at us." I asked her how it felt to, look back on those memories, and she said that the trauma continues unfolding. And I'm going to jump to this last one. This other lady said that, he could see her tank top through her coat, started calling her a whore. So these are just a few of the experiences that, women in Iran go through. And there's so many untold stories. And I feel like all of these stories are truly profound and paint a picture that the world needs to see.
Nazanin, you just recently were working with your fellow Persians in Persia's Got Talent, which you told me was taped in Stockholm. You must have had a lot of first-person stories like this.
There's a lot of first-person stories about general life under the Islamic Republic in Iran and how it had gotten worse, because actually it was an interesting is the wrong word. It was a difficult time when we shot the first part of the season, because it was in November 2019, which is known as Bloody November. It was Aban Ma, and it was when there was a huge mass uprising in Iran, and the government quashed these protests within like 3 days. And as far as we know, 1,500 people were killed, massacred, slaughtered by the regime for protesting for human rights. And so we noticed too that the time span between all of these uprisings just in the last 4 years has gotten shorter and shorter, because it's very indicative of how fed up the people are living under the repression that they have been for the last now 44 years. And to the first question too, myself, the first time I went to Iran, I was born and raised in the States. And the first time I went, I was 9 years old. And that's the age where you're technically supposed to start covering as a girl in Iran. And my family wanted me to have a good time. I have a very large family in Iran, and they were so happy that, they got to meet me for the first time and see my parents again. And they try to shield you from the oppression of the country. And that's one of the biggest things I always clocked when I would visit Iran is, we know how bad it is and we know what they're living under, but they never want us to have to experience it. And that's just part of the, hospitable, empathetic nature of our culture. And we were walking to an amusement park with my uncles and some family, and I was wearing denim shorts and a shirt. And I just remember that a morality police officer came toward us and just started saying, "Why is she wearing that? Why isn't she covered? You need to take her and put clothes on her, et cetera, et cetera." And as a 9-year-old, you have no idea what's going on. And then you start thinking you've done something wrong, which is a terrible impression to leave in a young girl's mind for many different reasons. And I just remember that they explained it away, that I had just come to America, and that's the reason I was let go. And something very similar happened when I went there. I was actually there for the Green Movement during the elections and the protests. And I was walking home with my cousins and my sister at night in Karaj. And we were stopped by morality police, and they said that our headscarves were not being worn properly. They got out of the car and they're like, what are you doing here? What's happening? Who are these people? Why are you together? Where are you coming from? And the only thing that saved us again was the fact that these were actually my cousins and we shared the same last name, and that he explained away, oh, they're American, they didn't know any better, et cetera, et cetera. So that leaves me always feeling guilty that, the only thing that spared my life or me receiving any of these types of things was my citizenship in America. So, this is an everyday thing that happens to Iranian people.
So a question for you about the tipping point of Mahsa Amini. So for those of you who have been living under a rock, the latest round of energy behind the revolution in Iran was the beating and brutal killing of Mahsa Amini by the morality police for not wearing her hijab. And my sense of it was that this became a tipping point for many people. What happened in that situation, and what happened today that made this such a catalyst for change? Why now?
I feel like the best way that I can describe it, as I have in the past, is that the same way George Floyd was a powder keg moment for America to reckon with systemic racism and police brutality, Mahsa Amini's death at the hand of the morality police was also a powder keg moment for Iranians to say, we've had enough. We've had enough. Another young woman's life, snuffed out for what? And so that was it. And as I mentioned before, the protests that have taken place in Iran over the last 44 years, they had some big gaps in between them. But since about 2015, 2016, 2017 and on, the gap has shortened and shortened and shortened because people are fed up with everything: the repression, the suppression of religious minorities, ethnic minorities, the LGBTQ community, the economy, the freedoms that they don't have. It's just everything just kind of came to a head and exploded. And it's almost like there's so many reasons for Iranians to be able to pour out into the streets and voice their frustrations, and that was just happened to be the tipping point of that moment. Ladies, how do you feel?
I was just curious. I mean, is this protest showing more progress than the earlier ones? Because we've obviously seen these revolts happen and get repressed, and then the regime gets worse.
Yeah, if it's okay for me to speak
please.
about that. Yeah, so I think things are completely different this time around for three reasons, and the most important one being that this is being primarily driven by Generation Z. In the past, older generations were afraid of speaking up against the Islamic Republic because of the dangers of the regime, right? This regime is not a joke. Once they came into power, within a couple of years, they ended up executing about 30,000 individuals. And then they again executed another 30,000 during the Iran-Iraq war, or up to 30,000 during that war. Our loved ones, family, friends, so many people have endured physical and or emotional abuse under this regime for living their regular lives. So the baby boomers and the millennials were essentially taught to accept their fate. But Generation Z is fed up. They see how other people are living freely via social media, and they refuse to continue living under this dictatorial and theocratic regime. And in talking to the youth in Iran, I've come to learn that they genuinely feel as though they have nothing to live for. When I ask them about their dreams and aspirations, they refuse to answer the question, saying that thinking about their dreams only brings them sadness because the regime has stripped them of every single dream. And then on top of it, it's not just the women who are coming out in protest. The men are also coming out in support of them because of their own oppression and because they're supporting women's rights. And they all essentially have nothing to lose. And they're willing to give up everything for a better tomorrow. So that answers the part one of that question. Part two is that, this is the first time Iranians are protesting major human rights violations. In the past, a lot of it has had to do with economic crises. The very first one was actually women rising up against the regime during actually a month after the Islamic Republic came into power. But this is very different in the sense that we're dealing with major human rights violations. And then lastly, the previous protests were snuffed out by state repression, namely via internet restrictions. Nazanin mentioned the bloody Alban in 2019, where an estimated number of 1,500 individuals were massacred. And we actually didn't realize that happened until we look back in retrospect because of the internet restrictions. And in this entire process, we, the Iranian diaspora, we haven't really allowed that to happen this time. The protesters asked us to amplify their voices, and we took every single image, every text, every video, and amplified it to the best of our abilities to support them. And I think that had the Iranian diaspora and our allies not aggressively taken to social media, I think this revolution would have died a long time ago. And there's evidence to support this. Audio was leaked from the Islamic Republic in December, where they discussed how they were losing the social media war and how they need to increase their investments on social media operations. So,
is there an underlying support for the regime that keeps this going beyond just the corruption of the regime itself, right? The economic, interrelationship between power and the regime. But what is that popular underlying logic sound like for people who are fighting against this liberalization?
I also think it's important to note about that question that for many years, there haven't been many diaspora voices that have been able to be in the ear of government and elected officials. And those who have been haven't always painted the most accurate picture. They've been accused of whitewashing the crimes of the Islamic Republic and so forth. And what we've seen right now, as Montreh mentioned, is also the unity in the diaspora is something we've never seen to this level before. We've all worked together with Iranians inside of Iran, outside of Iran, with leading activists and human rights experts to get the Islamic Republic kicked off of the Commission on the Status of Women, for example, to now create a fact-finding mission under the UN Human Rights Commission to investigate abuses and crimes against humanity. So they're being held accountable in a way that they've never been held accountable before. And another thing to note about what makes this difference in the way that it's been sustaining is we have Iranians from all sectors of life that have been striking, that have been pulling their monies out of the financial institutions for a while now to hurt the economy and to hurt the Islamic Republic, as well as you've had Iranians from all of the provinces inside of Iran now joining in. For example, in 2009's Green Movement, it was mostly contained to Tehran. Everybody was out in Tehran and then it got quashed. But right now we're seeing every single province has come out. One of the biggest chants is from Zahedan to Tehran, Janam Fadaye Iran, which means from Zahedan, which houses ethnic minorities, to Tehran, the capital, we're all going to give our lives for Iran. So the unity inside and outside is something we haven't seen before. And as Montreh mentioned, there's no going back from this point. We hit the tipping point. So whether it's going to be a year, 2, 3 years from now, this regime will fall. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
What do you think it's going to take for that tipping point or that last little domino to fall? What are they, for instance, are the economic sanctions that the West is imposing actually having an impact here, or is that a factor, or what else could potentially make that final thing happen?
I can start with this one.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Take over. I do feel like the more pressure that we have from the US, from Canada, from the EU, all of the way that things are going now, to have targeted sanctions on regime officials, to stop negotiating with this regime, to do whatever they can to actually support the Iranian people instead of things that embolden the regime, which is what I see that the tide has turned that way. I believe that all of these things combined together, along with leading opposition voices from inside Iran, joining in with outside of Iran to present a united front to different elected officials and world leaders as people to be speaking to and helping and negotiating with instead of the regime. Those are the things that are going to push this movement forward. And I'll leave it to you, ladies.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think we're really depending on our international politicians to assist with this process. They keep condemning the regime and the oppression of the people through their words, but their actions continue to contradict their words. Over the past couple of days, a couple of European nations, at least, congratulated the Islamic Republic on their 44th anniversary, essentially, that happened on this Saturday. And throughout this entire process, Blinken and Rob Malley, they've been saying that they stand in solidarity with the Iranian people, all while pushing for ongoing negotiations with the Islamic Republic. And it's been quite devastating, to be honest. They've been pushing for the JCPOA throughout this entire process. And I don't really
define that. Is that the
nuclear deal?
Yeah.
nuclear deal. Yeah, I can't seem to wrap my mind around why they would want to negotiate with these dictators that are a global threat who won't pull through with the negotiations anyway. Even if they sign the deal, they're not going to pull through on their end when they have a prime opportunity to help us replace the regime with a secular government that will significantly enhance world peace. I mean, this regime funds much of the terrorism in the region that the U.S. invests trillions of dollars to battle. They literally invested $6.4 trillion in the Middle East and in Asia since 2001. And that's all the money that could be spent towards creating shelters for our homeless populations here in the US, that could be spent on reducing homelessness, spent on our educational systems. Like, why keep them in power when you have the opportunity to eliminate them?
Is the, in other countries where we see repressive regimes, the relationship between the military and the government when it comes to the economic power of the country is very tight. In places like Pakistan, for instance, places like China, the regime and the military kind of collaborate together. I suppose that's a nice way of saying it, to be able to create a kind of a focus of economic power that keeps the military in power, in essence, because they have an economic incentive to remain in power. Is that how it works in Iran? And what would undo that?
Well, that's also a great point, because the Sepah, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, were literally created by the Islamic Republic to protect the Republic. So they're separate from the other police forces for that reason of people turning. So I also think, part of what needs to happen for this tipping point to continue forward is that members of the IRGC, members of these elite forces need to turn. I personally believe that, based on the information we get from inside of Iran and the knowledge that we have from these last few months, these things are happening, albeit maybe slower than anybody would like. But, revolutions take time. So this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. But that's part of the thing that needs to happen as well, is the armed forces, the Sepah in specific, the IRGC, need to turn as well to help the people.
Let me just, as we, begin to sort of, this has been a great discussion. Let me ask a difficult and a very difficult question, which is, how are we going to reconcile Islam with the beliefs in women's rights and with gay rights? Is this something that Iran could, because we don't see much of that in the rest of the Islamic world. We find it in Islamic communities in other parts of the world, like in France or in the US. Is this a fundamental contradiction, or is there a way that Iran could be a place that will find a way to maintain an Islamic character, but also embrace these values?
I'd like to make one point about that, because I would love for people not to conflate the Islamic Republic with Iran and its culture, because we have a 2,500 plus year history that dates back pre-Islam as well. And a lot of Iranians before were also Zoroastrian, or we have Jewish Iranians, we have Baha'i Iranians. So there's such a big mix of religious identities. And this fundamentalist theocratic approach just came in 1979. So before that, people were free to practice whatever religion they wanted freely. And so I do believe that there is a way to, to be able to observe whatever religion you want, to have that religious freedom, to keep the nation secular, and everyone will still be able to live freely. And it's a really tough question to answer, because I feel like Islam, by the Islamic Republic, the Taliban in Afghanistan, it's been hijacked, and it's a fundamentalist approach to whatever arbitrary thing that they want to use to rule and oppress people with. Anecdotally, I have grown up with, gone to school with many Muslim people who are extremely open and accepting, because they believe God says you must love everybody, et cetera, et cetera. So I believe there is a way to have religious freedom inside of Iran without it being used as a tool of oppression, but that's why we need secularism as well.
And
Montreh, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, people think of Iran as an Islamic country because of the ruling government, right? But the Iranian people are actually very westernized in their mentality and in their ways. There was a survey that was conducted by the Tony Blair Institute, and nearly 80% of those who were surveyed across various age ranges were against the mandatory hijab, and 84% of those actually wanted to live in a secular state. And I think they also mentioned that of the population that was surveyed, only 26% actually prayed a couple times a day. So we're dealing with a very different population than I think the West actually envisions, or at least envisions.
Very agnostic population. And also anecdotally, I just feel like the quickest way to turn a population either atheist or agnostic or to not believe in religion is to rule with a dictatorial theocracy, which is what's happened to many Iranians. I personally don't know many Iranians in my entire life that I've grown up here in America, whether it's here in Europe or even inside of Iran when I would visit, that are actually religious. And I feel like when you beat people over the head with religion or your form of religion, it's the quickest way to turn people off from it. So yeah, I don't necessarily believe it's a quote unquote Western thing. I just think it's something that's very specific to Iranians also because of the oppression that they've had to live under, that they're just turned off from religion. And that doesn't mean that they think that people cannot practice what they want freely. It's just more and more Iranians are agnostic or atheist.
Yeah, they've experienced a significant amount of religious trauma. If you even think back at the executions that have taken place of the protesters specifically, I'm not talking about the silent executions, which have been ongoing, but the 4 protesters who were executed, they were executed during morning prayer. And so now people in Iran, when they hear the morning prayer, they relate it to executions, among other things. So yeah, we're dealing with religious trauma here.
Mahnaz?
But I can add, yeah, I think Iranian are modern people. So Iranian women want equality in all sectors, and they're sick and tired of gender discrimination.
Yeah. And this pressure that is coming in, that is the way you're describing it, is kind of antithetical to the history and culture of the country as a whole. This stridency is, from the way you're describing it, creating a counter pressure that will ultimately have to be released through reform and through the regime getting getting
well,
gone.
I wouldn't say reform, but yeah, I think Nazanin raising her hand. Nazanin, go for it.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very divisive word because whereas there was a point in time where many Iranians inside of Iran thought that reform was possible. There's leading human rights activists and attorneys that also felt the same and pushed for it inside the country, very respected leaders, Nobel laureates, et cetera, for example. But, our job in the diaspora was always to amplify what the people of Iran wanted. And so at one point, a lot of people thought that that was possible, but that's been completely crushed. This regime is unreformable. So the people of Iran have made it very clear in no uncertain terms, they want the downfall of the Islamic Republic. They don't want, actually just recently, one of the leading candidates of the reform movement, which was back in the Green Movement era, Mir Hossein Mousavi, who was under house arrest for many years, has come out and said, this regime is not reformable. We need a new constitution. And it's almost like his voice, not almost like, his voice doesn't really matter anymore. It's drowned out by the voices of all the people who say, yeah, we knew that already. Welcome to the party, but you're not, is kind of the general consensus. And so, yeah, that word is, kind of out of everybody's vernacular when it comes to the future of Iran.
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm glad that Nazanin mentioned all of that because we've also noticed a significant change in the regime's strategy in terms of how they're dealing with the demonstrations and the protests. We, like I said, the Iranian diaspora, when anything was happening, we started screaming people's names. We're showing the world the clips that were going on, that were coming out of the country. And the regime knows that all eyes are on them. So they haven't been able to commit the same crimes that they had several years ago, for example, during Bloody Alban, when they killed the 1,500 people within a week. And they tried to see whether they could get away with it this time. Including the 4 executions of the protesters, but they realized that method isn't going to work. So they're actively changing their strategy. If you notice, the last again, not silent executions, but the last execution of the protesters were nearly 40 days ago. And they've started releasing some, although few prisoners. And it seems like they're not out on the streets randomly beating and shooting at people, at least not in the same way that they typically do. And I think that's because they realize that the more they kill, the more content we have to post about, and the more content we have, the louder the public outcry. And they don't want that kind of attention, especially with the UN investigation. So going back to what Nazanin said about the Green Movement, so that happened in 2019, and it was over the rigged elections that led to the re-election of President. What did I say? I'm sorry, yeah, I meant 2009. Thank you. So it led to the re-election of President Ahmadinejad over Musavi. And like she said, he's been in house arrest, and he's come out, and he was more of a progressive type and the type of member in the regime, if there is such a thing. And now the Islamic Republic, since they realize that there's no way that people are going to accept this regime any longer, I think that they're actually trying to use them as a tool to push for reform.
Well, the other thing about that is like it is also kind of it is what's the word I'm looking for? I'm so sorry. It's an oxymoron to say like a progressive Islamic regime.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, they're not progressive in any shape or form. And that 2009 elections were obviously fraudulent. I was there 2 days before the election. I watched the fallout. I mean, it was terrible. And it's the same story, different cast, same script, different cast that we've seen over the last however many years. But yeah, reform is just not possible with this regime, and nobody is calling for that. And as Montreh pointed out with the prisoners that they're releasing now, if you look at who they're releasing, yeah, there's some artists that they've let go, thank God, and these prisoners of conscience shouldn't be in jail to begin with. But a lot of the most important voices, not most important, the more notable voices are still in jail. Today is the 100th day of solitary confinement for Iranian rapper Toumaj Salehi, who's been a leading voice in the opposition inside of Iran. So why are they keeping him in there? Obviously, because they know that he can affect change and galvanize the people, which is what he was doing. Nasrin Sotoudeh, prominent human rights lawyer, her husband got taken in now. I mean, anybody who has a bright mind, who is an artist, who poses any type of threat to the stability of this regime will be held in there, tortured, maybe executed, God forbid. So they know what they're doing as far as looking like they're having some sort of leniency or clemency, but we know the real deal. That's not what's happening. Khamenei actually came out 2 weeks ago and said something about how we're going to give clemency to some of these prisoners of conscience. We're going to release them. And the caveat was they have to write a statement of confession to their crimes. And as we all know, forced confessions are Islamic Republic playbook. So what are they going to do? What would they do with those forced confessions down the road? You never know. They could use it to execute these people again or re-imprison them. So it's all just a farce on the side of the Islamic Republic.
Well, I'll tell you, this has been fascinating, but we'd like to sort of wrap up with, I want to ask each of you two different things. One, what should the US be doing, and what can we as citizens do to help with this? And the second thing is, how much longer do you think this regime is going to last? So why don't we start with you, Mahnaz, and we'll ask everyone.
I know there is no going back, and the revolution will continue and be stronger with the support of people outside of Iran. We can help this revolution by writing to our political representative and asking them to support the people of Iran. And I hope we'll have free Iran soon.
So should the government do something, to the US government be stronger on this?
Yes, of course. Definitely the US could do more by pulling out of the nuclear talks with Iran.
And anybody?
Nazanin, you want to take that as a
Montreh, do you want to
take those questions?
Sure. I mean, Nazanin, do you want me to go first, or you? It's up to you. Okay. In terms of how long it's going to take, I think initially we had really hoped that it was going to be a quick turnover, but we weren't really realistic about it. If you think about it, with the last revolution, it took a year, it took 12 months. And that was with the backing of the US and the CIA and whatnot. So we are kind of isolated in this at this point. I'm hoping it's not going to stay like that. But realistically speaking, I think it's probably going to take some time, maybe a year or two.
Yeah, probably. Hopefully sooner, but it's going to take
but in terms of what the US can do, I mean, we really need our politicians to continue co-sponsoring and to support the Massa Act, which I think Nazanin is probably going to end up talking about a little more. But this is meant to place sanctions on the leaders of the Islamic Republic, and it could potentially help break the back of the JCPOA, which is what we're desperately in need of. But in terms of like actionable things that people can do, I recommend following the Instagram handle action_for_Iran on Instagram. This group puts out petitions and mail to links with one-click emails that are directed to politicians, among others. And our needs are constantly changing on a daily basis. And this is a group that's on top of it. So you can find their petitions and links on their Instagram stories and their Telegram page. And if it's important enough, quote unquote, it also ends up in their Instagram handles. Another thing that people should do is start joining our protests. Show the world that you stand in solidarity with the Iranian people. I haven't really asked the different organizations whether I have permission to speak about them in this podcast, but I think I can speak for Philly Iran. This is a group in Philadelphia. People can reach out to the Instagram handle Philly Iran, and we'd be more than glad to direct individuals to the right pages for information about the protest based on their location. And then last but not least, amplifying the voices of the Iranian people. It's really important to continue amplifying their voices. Keep talking about what's happening. Don't stop. This is the one opportunity we have to save the lives of 88+ million individuals who are living in Iran and their future generations. And this is a moment, it's like a make or break moment where either we win this revolution or they continue living under the oppression of this dictatorial, theocratic, oppressive regime.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nazanin, last words from you.
I definitely agree with everything that they said. Amplifying the voices of the Iranian people is so important because what we've seen over the years is the news cycle just carries what's going on in Iran for maybe 48 hours and then it's done. And it's up to us outside of Iran as well to continue to keep Iran in the spotlight. We need to keep the pressure on our elected officials. What Montreh talked about the Massa Act, one of the main things of that act going through, it is targeted sanctions on regime officials and anyone who works with them or is affiliated with them. But what it also does is it adds, instead of just having asset freezes, it will add asset seizure. Which would make it easier to, when you seize the assets, then you could put it into a fund for a future democratic Iran to help rebuild Iran and or to help pay victims of the crimes committed by the Islamic regime officials. So it's really important for the people of Iran because that can actually help them in the future. As far as the timeline, realistically, of course, it's going to take time. How long? You never know because there's what's that famous quote? I'm not going to remember it verbatim, but it's something about, things are the way they are until they're not, because anything can change at the drop of a hat. I do believe in a future free Iran. I know it's coming, and I do think it's going to take some time. It's not going to be as quick as everybody would like, but it is going to happen. But joining our protests for sure, standing in solidarity with us, because if you believe in human rights and women's rights and crushing gender apartheid and crushing oppression and dictatorial, theocratic, murderous, fascist regimes, you should stand with the Iranian people and stand on the right side of history. Because again, it's not if this regime falls, it's just a matter of when. So we would love for everyone to come on our side now.
Well,
Nazanin, done better.
Nazanin, Montreh, and Mahnaz, thank you so much for sharing your stories and for sharing your perspective. We look forward to having you back to get an update on hopefully positive progress going on in this regard. And thank you all for being on the Feudal Future podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
The Feudal